One common kind of equation is sort of an extension of quadratic equations, is equations of quadratic type. Now, strictly speaking, they're not quadratic equations, but you can turn them into quadratic equations, and you can pretty much solve them at least by using a lot of quadratic equation stuff. So let's look at 3 different examples of equations of quadratic type. The first thing I want to put down is x to the 6th minus 2x cubed minus 3 equals 0. Now you can clearly see that's not a quadratic equation, because a quadratic equation would have x squared and would have 2x cubed. But we can make a substitution where I can write down u equals x cubed, and then if I square that, I'm going to get u squared equals x to the 6th. Now, putting those 2 substitutions in there, what we're going to see is we can turn this into u squared minus 2u minus 3 equals 0, and that is a quadratic equation. So at this point, we could actually solve this way. Now, this is one way that books actually go about it, saying making a substitution. Other books just say, just rewrite this. Once I realize that x to the 6th is x cubed squared, they'll just say to write it like this: x cubed squared, like that, and then minus 2x cubed, and then minus 3 equals 0. And you can read that x cubed quantity squared minus 2x cubed minus 3 equals 0, or with a little bit more color, right? That looks like blob squared minus 2 blob minus 3 equals 0, where the blob looks like this. In other words, we can turn this equation, which doesn't look like a quadratic equation, into a quadratic equation either by a substitution or by trying to think a little bit more generally. Let's look at another example. The next example I want to look at looks like 2x to the 2/5. Oops, this is example 2, sorry. I want 2x to the 2/5 plus 3x to the 1/5 minus 2 equals 0. Clearly that's not a quadratic equation, but once we realize that x to the 2/5 is just x to the 1/5 squared, we could make a substitution. We can just say u is equal to x to the 1/5, and then u squared. I square both sides, I'm going to get x to the 2/5. So what I'm going to get here is I'm going to get 2u squared plus 3u minus 2 equals 0, which is a quadratic equation. And from this point forward, we can solve this like a quadratic equation. But the hard part seems to be recognizing the original equation as an equation of quadratic type. But you look at that middle term, and if that middle term variable squared is equal to the highest term variable squared, we could rewrite this as 2 times blob squared plus 3 times blob minus 2 equals 0. And from this point, we could actually try to factor in the same way we could try to factor this. Now, you should just try to get comfortable with one of them, either rewriting this so it looks like 2 blob squared plus 3 blob minus 2 equals 0 and trying to factor, or make that substitution so you can actually see it clearly. It's quicker if you can just recognize the pattern on top, but doing it this way on the bottom is perfectly fine. One more example. All we're trying to do here is get used to seeing equations of quadratic type. We'll address solving them in the next video. So our third example is just going to look like 4 over x squared plus 3 over x plus 5 equals 0. I'm going to write this just a little bit differently. I'm going to write this so you can see what we're going to do. This is 4 times 1 over x quantity squared plus 3 times 1 over x plus 5 equals 0, like that. And then I'm going to let u equal to 1 over x, and then squaring it, I get u squared is 1 over x quantity squared. And so this equation is going to turn into 4u squared plus 3u plus 5 equals 0 like that, and that is a quadratic equation, and we can solve this any way we solve a quadratic equation. Now in the end, we have to go back and solve for x. But right now, the hard part is just looking at an equation that's clearly not a quadratic equation and recognizing that we can either rewrite it so we get 4 blob squared plus 3 blob plus 5 and solve that for blob. Or we can make a substitution that turns it actually into an authentic quadratic equation that we can solve that way. So those are 3 examples of quadratic type.